In 1871 in Texas, a diary was found on a cedar shelf inside a county courthouse. Its leather was cracked, its clasp rusted, its pages swollen with the humidity of summers that refused to let paper remain still. The clerk who logged it in the accession book expected nothing more than another record of weather, debts, or family quarrels. But when the covers parted, a paradox was already waiting. The first entries belonged to a girl. The loops of her letters wavered, ink uneven, pressure faint. She wrote of the harvest, of brothers arguing over cattle, of a hymn repeated in church until the lines blurred into sound. Each word was plain, hesitant, mortal. Then the entries reached their conclusion. The last dated line in her own hand. The date that matched the notice of her death written in county registers, 1874. The diary should have ended there, but it did not. On the next page, a new entry appeared, in a script eerily similar, yet unmistakably not hers. The ink darker, the strokes firmer, the spelling corrected, the sentences longer. The words carried her name, her family, her neighbors, all noted as if she were still present, still walking the town. The dates were later than her burial. 1875. 1876. Years she did not live, written in a book she no longer held. The handwriting shifted with seasons, but no living writer could be identified. The clerk compared it with neighbors' hands. It matched none. The county school teacher's scrawl tilted right, this hand leaned left. The pastor's sermons looped high, this hand sank low. The words on the page seemed to echo her voice but corrected it, sustained it, extended it into years she was denied. A diary that wrote itself, or was written by no one at all. The margin note is small, easy to miss. The accession clerk wrote only 3 words beside the impossible pages, not assigned. The entry was not assigned to any writer, not aligned with any witness, not compatible with any affidavit or testimony. The diary existed, yet it refused ownership. Think of what this means. A girl dies, but her diary continues. A book that should serve as memory instead becomes an invention. In that invention, she is both resurrected and confined. The ledger keeps her alive, but only as the ledger's version of her. Not her body, not her breath, only her persistence on paper. Folklore is filled with warnings of this kind. Villagers once told stories of quills that would not still, scratching names onto parchment in candlelight long after the hand that held them had gone. They told of ledgers that tallied debts for men buried years earlier, of parchment that grew new lines like a tree sprouting rings. Tales to remind us that writing is never neutral. A word written can outlive its author. A sentence left unfinished may be finished by something else. Here in Texas, it was no longer tale but artifact. A book that behaved as if time were porous, as if the line between memory and invention could be crossed by ink alone. The paradox is cruel in its clarity. A diary is supposed to hold what has happened. This one insisted on what could not have happened. Each new entry after her death was both a denial and a confirmation, denying her absence by writing her presence, confirming her absence by proving no living hand admitted to it. The diary became a coffin that breathed. Locals whispered about it in the years that followed. They said the courthouse clerk locked the diary in a drawer every evening, only to find new sentences when he opened it the next morning. They said flames refused it. When someone tried to consign it to the courthouse stove, the leather blistered and blackened, but the pages within uncurled, the ink still sharp, the dates still unaltered. They said the book was still processing, a phrase that did not belong to law or to faith, but to the strange comfort of delay. Neighbors added their own folklore. Some claimed the girl had been a changeling all along, a child not meant for this world, who returned through paper when her body was gone. Others insisted it was the work of revenant ink, an echo of her voice trapped in the fibers that replayed itself like a record groove long after silence had fallen. A few believed the diary had learned her, that the pages, having carried her hesitations and loops for years, decided they could carry them without her. We begin here tonight, with a diary that writes past its author. Not a ghost story, but a paper story. Not a haunting, but an audit of ink and date. of absence that behaves like presence. And we will not rush. These cases require a slower breath than the world usually permits. They unfold the way paper does when dropped into water, swelling gradually, revealing marks that lay hidden in its pulp. Tonight we open the drawer, sit with the ledger, and allow it to breathe its impossible sentences into the air again. You are welcome to stay, to listen without urgency, to let the sound of a book that writes itself accompany you through the quiet of your room, through the time it takes to feel night deepen. And if you have not subscribed, think of it not as a click, but as a ritual, a way of walking with others through these long corridors of forgotten files. These stories are never short. They demand company. And if you are listening now, tell me your country and the time. There is solace in knowing the same forgotten diary is being opened across oceans, across clocks, as if we are all reading the same impossible page together. The courthouse where the diary lived was not grand. No marble, no dome, no gaslight chandeliers. Only cedar and pine planed into walls that smelled of resin long after the men who hammered them were gone. The room that held the diary was narrow, with windows that swallowed more dust than sun, their panes fogged by years of fingerprints never cleaned. The shelf was simple, cut from cedar, its edge uneven, still holding the memory of the saw that bit into it. Dust had built in pale layers, each layer a calendar no one kept. The clerk who stored the diary there probably thought it was one among many, just another volume stacked upright, its spine leaning against law books too wide and heavy for its company. But cedar has a way of holding breath. You can press your face to it even now and smell the ghost of its sap, sharp and faint, a reminder that wood never stops remembering what it was. The desk in the room told the same story. Along its edge, a groove had been pressed where wrists once rested, day after day as signatures were copied, as names were underlined. The skin of one century shaped the wood of the next. If you lean your wrist into that groove, it fits too neatly, as if the furniture were not passive but waiting for you, remembering the rhythm of Clerks long gone. Every object was a participant. The inkwell left rings on the desk like fossils of thought. The chair sagged at one joint, refusing to sit square. A nail had been hammered twice into the wall, leaving two shadows where a calendar had hung but not been replaced. The room contained its own evidence of duration. It did not require witnesses. And then, at the center of that cedar shelf, the diary. Its leather was pitted, scarred by fingernails that worried at its surface when no one was sure what to do with it. The clasp had rusted shut, then been forced open. Around its edges, a faint darkness showed where oil from hands had soaked through. It looked less like a book than like something that had survived a flood. The courthouse clerk's records described the room as quiet, orderly. But dust does not lie. Dust said otherwise. Dust gathered not just where it was allowed, but where it should not have been. Across the spines of law books, across the corners of maps, across the drawer handles. It was the dust of neglect disguised as order. It was the same dust that layered itself into the diary's pages, becoming part of the ink that appeared there without cause. Even the air in the room seemed part of the conspiracy. In summer it smelled of cedar and sweat, in winter of dry paper and iron stoves that hissed but never warmed evenly. The courthouse breathed shallow, as if it knew the weight of the pages it contained. Stand in that room long enough, and you understand the difference between silence and stillness. Silence is the absence of sound. Stillness is the presence of something waiting. The courthouse was not silent. Its wood creaked, its floor sighed, its nails loosened. It was still, in the way a drawer is still when you know it has something inside that does not want to be closed. Folklore helps us here. Old stories spoke of books that keep themselves. In some towns they were said to live in church attics, Bibles that added new verses in the margins, hymnals that sang from their spines when no one touched them. Children were told never to open such books alone. The fear was not that they would be harmed, but that they would be recorded, that the book would learn them, would carry them in its margins, would write them without asking. And there is another tangent from further south carried by traveling preachers and merchants, the story of the paper that drank, a tale of a diary that absorbed not only ink but whispers, footsteps, and prayers. Whatever was spoken near it would appear in faint lines, half-formed, as though the fibers of the page drank sound. Farmers told their children not to talk too loud in rooms with unattended Bibles, lest their secrets be absorbed. The diary in Texas seemed to obey that same folklore, becoming not only a record of a life, but of a silence that kept writing itself. The diary on the cedar shelf carried that same presence. It had already outlived its diarist. It had already written lines without permission. What else could it do but continue? The shelf held it like a reliquary. The desk received its weight. The room conspired with it to keep the illusion of order while permitting the impossible to continue. Even the label on the shelf failed to confine it. In careful script, a clerk had written, "Diary admitted, 1871. The word admitted belongs to hospitals, to prisons, to asylums, not to books. And yet here it was, as if the courthouse itself knew the diary was not a volume but a patient, a case, an intake that had not been released. That is why we linger here on cedar and desk and dust before we open the pages. Because the objects know, the groove of the desk knows, the resin of the wood knows, the clasp that resists opening knows. They remember more faithfully than any clerk. Paper ages, but cedar breathes. Leather cracks, but drawers keep their secrets. These objects were witnesses, and in their quiet endurance they confirm what the file cannot. That the diary lived here, that it kept itself alive, that its presence was more than words. So before we move deeper into its records, we pause in the room itself. We breathe its cedar, we feel the grooves, we accept the waiting. Because what we are about to read is not only the continuation of a girl's diary beyond her death, it is the continuation of a courthouse, a shelf, a room that allowed a book to become more alive than its writer. The diary begins as any other might. Its first lines are small, hesitant, written in a hand that presses more lightly at the start of a word than at the end. The girl's script leans unevenly, the curves of her letters collapsing into themselves. She writes about chores, about a calf sick in the pen, about a hymn sung too many times in church until it sounded like the voice of one person instead of a congregation. These are mortal entries, ordinary to the point of vanishing, the kind of words that survive only because paper remembers what people forget. The first contradiction waits just a few pages in. Her last signed entry is dated May 3, 1874. The county record confirms it. Her death notice, written in another book entirely, is dated May 4th. The ledger of lives ended insists she did not live beyond that day. And yet, when the diary is turned, May 7th appears in the same journal, in a hand not quite hers but close enough to disturb. The date is written as if no interruption had occurred. The ink darker, the strokes firmer, the words steadier than she had ever managed in life. What follows is more than imitation. It is a correction. Where she had once spelled him as him, the new hand writes it with exactness. Where her loops once faltered, the new hand carries them with ease. It is as if the diary had learned her, then improved her. A girl who died in 1874 writes as though she survived to 1875, more articulate, more precise, more permanent. The county clerk, when he catalogued it years later, tried to be clinical. In the margin he wrote, "Hand differs." Then another note, "Not assigned." The words are stark. A book that contains writing which belongs to no one, a ledger that speaks without witness. The smudged signature is another contradiction. On May 3rd, the girl ends her entry with her initials, as she had done dozens of times before. The M is shaky, the R drags its tail below the line, the ink smears where the heel of her hand brushed it. On May 7th, the initials appear again, but they are clean, upright, almost professional. It is not the same hand, it is not the same body, yet it uses her name as if she were still alive to own it. The missing travel log compounds the unease. For many rural families, diaries recorded movement, trips to market, visits to kin, wagon rides that lasted days. In her hand, such entries are sparse, almost apologetic. "To Austin," she writes once with no further detail. But in the continuations, travel multiplies. Dates list places she could not have reached, distances too great for the span of time given. In one entry, "Road to San Antonio, return the same day. Impossible by horse, improbable even by rail." The diary claims motion that could not occur, as if the page itself believed it had legs. Numbers mutate in the same way names did. In her authentic entries, she tallied small debts: eggs sold, fabric purchased, pennies kept. The arithmetic falters, sums wrong by 2 or 3, corrections made with small x's in the margin. After her death, the arithmetic improves. Totals align, errors vanish. The page evolves from child's hand to clerk's hand without transition. Fairy tales warned us that numbers change in forests, that names morph when spoken by the wrong lips. Here, the transformation happens at a desk, on cedar, under lamplight. Each micro-contradiction deserves to be spoken aloud, because silence serves the ledger too easily. The smudged versus the clean signature. The travel that never happened. The arithmetic that shifts from hesitant to perfect. The dates written past the grave. Each is small enough to excuse. Together they hum. They hum the way a drawer hums when closed against air, not fully shut, waiting to be opened again. The refrain, "not assigned," reappears in the county inventory beside the diary's accession line. Not assigned to an author. Not assigned to a family. Not assigned to an explanation. The phrase reads, less like classification and more like ritual denial. If you say often enough that words are not assigned, you never have to ask who is speaking. Even the diary's margins are complicit. In the earlier pages, her doodles are faint, small flowers, half-formed stars, the occasional initial practiced again and again. After 1874, the margins fill with stronger marks, underlines, corrections, even what appears to be commentary on her earlier words. Too dark, one line reads, next to her note about a hymn. Who wrote that? Not her. Not a living witness. Yet the page argues with itself. Folklore folds itself into this paradox. In rural Texas, parents warned their children about borrowed voices, echoes that did not belong to the speaker, but imitated someone lost. They said if you heard your name spoken at dusk in a familiar voice from an empty room, you should never answer because it was the paper of the world trying to write you into its margins. The diary is one of these borrowed voices, echoing a girl past her burial, correcting her words, writing her name as though it owned her. The county officials who handled the diary disagreed among themselves. One said forgery, another said clerical prank. A third refused to comment at all, signing only his initials with a note, "Do not annotate." They could not reconcile the paradox, so they tried to seal it with silence. But silence never erases ink. By the time the diary was locked into its cedar drawer, the contradictions had multiplied enough to form their own kind of testimony. It was no longer about whether she wrote past her death. It was about the fact that the diary refused to stop. That refusal was stronger than clerks, stronger than officials, stronger than explanation. This is the first record. A girl writes. A girl dies. A diary continues. The hand that follows is not hers, yet claims to be. The numbers align too neatly. The travel ignores geography. The margins speak in voices that should not exist. Each contradiction alone is survivable. Together they form a system of impossibility, and that system hums still, like cedar breathing in the dark. The ledger never stayed still. The first contradictions were troubling, but they could be dismissed by fatigue, by fraud, by a clerk's nervous hand. The second layer of record is where dismissal begins to fail. Here, two voices survive, speaking decades apart, both circling the diary as if it were alive. The first voice belongs to Miriam Ellis, a schoolteacher whose small notebook was later folded into the courthouse bundle. She had borrowed the diary briefly, in 1876, for what purpose no one recorded. Her own notebook speaks in short lines, fragments, as if she could not decide how much to commit. June 14th. Pages already written, turned, ink fresh, no hand present. June 15th. 2 lines not there last night. Who corrects the girl? Ooh. June 16th. Clerk laughs, says wood swells, makes marks, but wood does not spell. Each entry reads like a stanza in a poem she did not intend to write. She treats the diary not as an artifact but as a presence, a thing that joins her when she opens it. "Who corrects the girl?" she asks, and then falls silent. She never answers. Her notebook continues for weeks, the same refrain appearing in different shapes. Words not mine. Words not hers. Pages breathe. Shut drawer, sound continues. She stopped teaching the following year. The reason in county records is illness. Her private notebook tells a different story. No speech in room, only the page. Silence grows too large. The second voice is later, from a deposition taken in 1893. Elijah Carter, once a courthouse janitor, was questioned about the ledger during an audit. His testimony is halting, simple, as if he feared the weight of his own words. Question: Did you ever see additions to the diary? Answer: Yes. Morning after, not evening before. Question: Who wrote them? Answer: No one, or no one I saw. Question: How do you know they weren't already there? Answer: I dusted. Pages clean. Next day, ink. The examiner grows impatient. The transcript shows the rhythm breaking. Sir, diaries do not write. Who holds the pen? Elijah replies, book holds itself. Pen only waits. The examiner dismisses this as evasion, but the words remain, flat, undeniable. Book holds itself. Between the teacher's notebook and the janitor's deposition, the contradiction is confirmed. A woman notes fresh ink where no hand had been. A man testifies that pages changed between dusk and dawn. Two voices, decades apart, speaking in the same hesitant tone, both circling the same impossibility, and yet the strangest element is what they do not record. Neither voice describes fear. Not once does Miriam write that she is afraid. Not once does Elijah confess alarm. They speak instead of stillness, of silence, of a presence that is unsettling but not violent. Their words suggest a different kind of horror, not terror, but endurance. Silence itself becomes evidence. In Miriam's notes, room speaks nothing. In Elijah's deposition, book made quiet, as if the diary did not only write lines but consumed the sound around it. Folklore makes sense of this too. There are stories, whispered in farmhouses, of books that read their readers. A child opens a page, traces letters with her finger, and later finds her own thoughts written there in script not her own. Such stories warned of intimacy with paper. Too close, and the book learns you. Too slow, and the book records you. Parents told children to keep their secrets spoken, never written, for written words might be overheard by the fibers themselves. The Texas diary fits this shape. Miriam notes corrections to words she misspoke aloud. Elijah claims ink appeared where dust had been brushed away. The book does not just remember, it anticipates. It does not just copy, it amends. Both voices struggle to name it. Miriam writes, not hers, not mine. Elijah insists, book holds itself. Their language circles a center they cannot enter. They cannot say alive. They cannot say haunted. They fall back into the safer rhythm of denial. Not hers, not mine. Book holds itself, the negative form, repeated until it becomes liturgy. The courthouse records that follow echo the same rhythm. In the annual inventory of 1895, beside the diary's entry, someone has written, do not annotate. The instruction has no precedent in other volumes. Law books are annotated freely, maps corrected, deeds amended. Only here does the archive forbid commentary. Silence has become procedure. What emerges across these voices is a system that learns to survive by naming nothing. The teacher describes, but never interprets. The janitor testifies, but never concludes. The clerk writes, do not annotate, as if notes themselves might provoke more writing from the diary. The system accepts contradiction so long as no one dares to call it by name. And yet, when you set Miriam's notebook beside Elijah's deposition, they rhyme. One says pages breathe. The other says book holds itself. Both describe motion where stillness should be. Both acknowledge a presence that exceeds the hand. Both confirm the paradox without granting it explanation. This is the second record. Not proof, but confirmation. Not evidence of fraud, but of continuity. A girl's diary written beyond her years, witnessed by a teacher, testified to by a janitor. Both hesitant, both incomplete, both circling a silence they could not name. The first record showed us handwriting that shifted. The second gives us voices that refuse to deny what they saw, yet refuse to call it alive. Their restraint is itself an artifact, their hesitation the most faithful testimony. And silence, again, is the truest record. The diary thrives in it. When the diary was finally tested in the 1890s, the courthouse clerk's goal was not to mystify, but to prove it ordinary. He carried it to a table, set it beside a control book, and began with the simplest comparison: ink across time. One entry dated 1872, unquestionably in the girl's hand, was chosen as the control. The line was faint, brown at the edges, the way iron gall ink surrenders after 2 decades. Then he turned to an entry dated 1877, 5 years after her burial, one of the impossible continuations. If time had worked as it should, the contrast would have been immediate. The earlier ink faded, the later ink stronger, or at least distinguishable, but under the lamplight, both behaved as if they had been written together. The 1872 line darkened, then returned. The 1877 line darkened, then returned. Not one resisted, not one surrendered. They moved together, as though linked by a breath that refused to separate into before and after. The technician wrote the only words he dared: image unchanged. No exclamation, no interpretation. Just the fact, repeated twice in his notes. He did not use the word impossible, but his restraint is its own confession. He tried a second test. Distilled water brushed gently across the page. In ordinary diaries, water encourages ink to lift, to bleed, to feather outward. Here the ink refused to move. It stood firm, beads forming and rolling off as if the strokes had just dried that morning. The paper itself yellowed with age, but the ink would not follow. The technician noted another phrase: binder fresher than paper. Impossible. The carrier of pigment newer than the fibers it lay upon. Raking light revealed still stranger truths. Dust was sprinkled, brushed away, and beneath it the fibers glimmered with indentations deeper than the ink itself. Letters pressed into pulp before pigment filled them. Words pre-written into the body of the page, waiting to be darkened, like prophecies etched into bone before birth. The report phrases it clinically: impression precedes inscription. Yet the words sound closer to liturgy than science. One last anomaly unsettled him further. On the back-end paper, blank by design, faint soot appeared under magnification. Not atop the paper, but beneath its sizing, as though pressed there before the sheet was bound into the diary. The soot arranged itself into suggestion, still not ended. He would not admit it in his main report. He wrote it in his private notes instead, small, cautious, as though afraid even to carry the phrase into the archive. The official response was swift: dismiss. Ink tests are unreliable. Moisture plays tricks. Raking light exaggerates pressure. Soot inclusions happen in paper mills, each explanation designed not to explain but to reassure. And yet the notes remain. Image unchanged, binder fresher than paper. Impression precedes inscription. Still not ended. Science hesitates where folklore fills the gap. Old tales told of ink that breathed. In some villages, manuscripts were said to renew themselves each night, their colors restored, their pigments refusing to fade. Illuminated books that behaved as if someone kept painting them after the scribe had died. The Texas Diary joined that tradition, but with a darker twist. It did not merely resist fading. It performed the act of fading, then undid it, as though rehearsing age without accepting it. Another folklore strand comes from the hills, the tale of fire backward, ash that arrives before flame. Villagers claimed barns sometimes carried soot inside their beams before a match was ever struck, a premonition of the fire to come. The diary carried soot beneath its pages, residue of combustion that never happened, as though fire had written in it without ever touching it. A book that remembered being burned, even though it was not. Each test, Each anomaly becomes its own stanza. Ink darkens, then returns. Water beads, binder fresher than paper. Fibers show letters before ink arrives. Soot beneath surface still not ended. This is more than science. This is ritual exposed. A book that refuses time. A page that writes before it is written. A fire that leaves its trace before it burns. The technician, bound by the language of evidence, refused to call it alive. He wrote what he could defend. But in his silence we hear the weight of what he could not say. His notes betray not error, but awe. This is the forensic paradox. Evidence is supposed to resolve contradiction. Here, it only deepens it. The more the diary was tested, the more it rehearsed its refusal. The archive wanted closure. The book offered continuation. It is tempting to name this haunting. But haunting presumes absence. What we see here is presence. Presence that refuses decay. Presence that renews itself. Presence that chooses to remain on the page, no matter what reagent or flame demands otherwise. We sit with the report because it asks us to. Image unchanged. Read once, it sounds clinical. Read twice, it becomes refrain. Read a third time, it feels like prophecy. The lesson is not that ink deceives or that clerks lie. The lesson is that the archive itself has learned how to refuse ending. A diary is not meant to live longer than its diarist. This one does. And so the impossible beat is complete. A book that should have surrendered to time instead rehearses time and returns unchanged. The page becomes more permanent than the body. The residue outlives the life, and the drawer waits as always for another test. The first refrain hides in the courthouse slips. Each time the diary was checked out for review, a return ticket was stapled to its flyleaf. The earliest slips are quiet, practical. Hold until observation. A phrase meant to mark a temporary delay, as if the book were awaiting study. But the slips multiply. Dozens, then scores, stapled one atop another. Each bears the same line. Hold until observation. At some point the words cease to mean anything beyond their own repetition. There was no observation. There was only holding. By 1881, the phrase shifts. The slip reads, "Not compatible." No explanation. No initials. The clerk has imported a term from elsewhere, a word used in mechanical reports, not books. Not compatible with what? With the law? With other records? With itself? The phrase lingers like a curse, stamped onto cheap paper, rusting staples holding it against the diary's leather. In the census margin of 1885, the echo takes another form. Enumerators were told to list names, relations, and property, nothing more. Yet beside the line where the courthouse holdings are described, a faint pencil adds, "Not aligned." It is not an official note. It is not part of procedure. But there it is, 3 small letters tilted left, pressed into paper that did not ask for them. Not aligned. The census denies it, but the margin insists. The court memo of 1890 deepens the rhythm. The board requests an account of uncatalogued holdings. The reply, typed on onion skin paper, lists totals, then adds, "Several volumes remain still processing." Still processing. The phrase is absurd when applied to a book, yet it appears in the record as calmly as if it were any other description. A book does not process. A book is read or ignored. But here, still processing becomes a condition, a status, an identity. One refrain has become 3. Hold until observation. Not aligned. Still processing. Each phrase different, yet all circling the same refusal. Delay, denial, continuation. None grant an ending. The echoes scatter wider. A medicine card meant for hospital supplies carries the stamp. Not for ward use. The ink bleeds faintly into the line where the diary's accession number is listed, as if the label slipped. A shelf tag decades later repeats, "Still processing." A donor report congratulates the county for its quiet collections, words meant for objects, but suspiciously close to the diary's condition. Even the Teacher S notebook and Janitor S deposition from earlier years can be read now as echoes. Miriam's line, "Words not mine, words not hers." Elijah's, "Book holds itself." Both phrases circle the refrain without naming it, Both echo the incantation by refusing closure. This is what happens when words repeat. At first, they describe, then they explain, then they justify, and finally, they become ritual, spoken for their own survival. Hold until observation. Not aligned. Still processing. The courthouse did not only record these phrases, it believed them. Folklore interprets again. Tales from Europe warned of charms written on slips of paper, repeated until the charm itself became stronger than the intention. To whisper a line 3 times was to bind a creature. To write a phrase in 3 hands was to make it permanent. The diary's refrains obey the same logic. Each mutation strengthens it. Hold until observation becomes not aligned, becomes still processing. 3 hands, 3 decades, 1 binding. Silence is the final echo. When inspectors visited, they did not mention the diary at all. Their reports listed ledgers of births, deeds, mortgages, but never the volume that wrote itself. Silence as refrain. Silence as incantation. To omit a thing repeatedly is to give it its own ritual power. Set these echoes side by side, and the pattern is undeniable. Slip stapled, hold until observation. Margin penciled, not aligned. Memo typed, still processing. Tag stamped, not for ward use. Notebook whispered, words not mine. Deposition confessed, book holds itself. Together they form a choir of refusal. None of them scream. None of them explain. They hum quietly, insistently, until the courthouse itself feels less like a place of law and more like a chapel where liturgy is performed by paper. We pause here, because the temptation is to dismiss. To say these are only words, only clerks repeating what others wrote. But rituals are always built from small, repeated acts that no one questions. A gesture, a phrase, a refrain. Do it often enough, and it summons a reality no one asked for, but everyone serves. That is what the courthouse did. It summoned a book that would not end. It held it until observation, then declared it not aligned, then left it still processing. Each phrase a spell, each spell a reinforcement. This is the pattern echo. Not myth, not fraud, but bureaucracy drifting into incantation. A diary that writes itself, and a system that teaches itself to repeat the words that allow it to continue. Every system that survives learns to protect itself. By the 1890s, the diary was no longer just a book. It had become a function, a tool in the courthouse's arithmetic. The officials who wrote "still processing" and "not aligned" were not merely recording anomalies. They were preserving an arrangement that suited them. Backlog was the first mask. In law, unfinished cases are proof of activity. An office with no pending matters looks idle, vulnerable to budget cuts. But an office with volumes still processing appears busy, alive, deserving of funds. The diary that refused to end became backlog incarnate. Each year it was reported as ongoing. Each decade it remained unresolved. Its refusal gave the courthouse proof of perpetual labor. A case that never ended was more valuable than one that did. Tranquility was the second mask. County boards depended on wealthy patrons who demanded reassurance that their money bought stability. They did not want stories of dispute or scandal. They wanted order, continuity, quiet. The phrase "quiet collections" appears in donor reports because silence could be sold. And what better emblem of silence than a diary that absorbed sound and returned nothing? A book that wrote without protest, that demanded no explanation, that existed in its own cocoon of self-renewing ink. It was the perfect advertisement, evidence that the courthouse preserved so thoroughly it could not even allow a book to die. Then came the invention of language. Not compatible, not aligned, still processing. Do not annotate. These were not terms of law. They were not terms of literature. They were inventions. A lexicon designed not to describe, but to conceal. A diary that writes itself could not be called miracle or haunting. Those words invited belief. Those words invited scandal. But call it not compatible, and suddenly it is only procedure. Call it still processing, and suddenly it is only administration. Vocabulary became shield. Vocabulary became mask. This is the genius of systems. When old categories collapse, new ones are invented. Folklore calls this changeling. A child replaced, explained away by myth. Religion calls this revenant. A body returned, explained away by fear. Bureaucracy calls this backlog. A book that writes itself, explained away by delay. Each term serves the same purpose: to prevent truth from disrupting order. In that prevention, the courthouse created its own archetype. Not girl, not writer, not forgery. Something in between. A permanent interim. A volume that existed forever between written and unwritten, finished and unfinished, owned and unassigned. The diary was no longer a record. It was an invention of the system. And the cruelty is that this invention served everyone but her. The girl's handwriting, her hesitations, her flawed sums, her misspelled hymns, all of it became raw material. Her mistakes were corrected by the phantom hand. Her silences were filled. Her diary resurrected her, but only as the system needed her. Improved, obedient, permanent. She was remembered in a way that erased her. Every participant, knowingly or not, joined the preservation. Miriam Ellis, the teacher who wrote, "Pages Breathe." Elijah Carter, the janitor, who testified, "Book holds itself." The clerks who stamped, "Hold until observation." The inspectors who avoided mention altogether. None of them invented the system, but all sustained it. Each refrain spoken, each silence chosen, reinforced the category the system desired. The pattern is familiar because it is universal. Institutions reward what they can measure. The courthouse could not measure truth, so it measured persistence. It could not measure life, so it measured continuation. A diary that refused to close became the most valuable artifact in the building. Silence was more valuable than testimony. Perpetuity was preferable to resolution. Listen again to the language that survives. Not compatible. Not aligned. Still processing. Do not annotate. Each phrase is a refusal. Each phrase is an invention. None describe the book. All protect the institution. By the end of the century, the diary had ceased to be literature in any meaningful sense. It was not read. It was reported. It was not questioned. It was categorized. The girl had long since vanished from its pages. What remained was backlog, reassurance, category. The courthouse kept it not because it was inexplicable, but because it was useful. This is the deeper horror. She became less than forgotten. Forgotten would have been release. Instead, she was remembered in a way that removed her. The system replaced her with an artifact it could measure, report, and use. She was overwritten by her own book. The diary lived longer than the girl it had once served, because the courthouse preferred permanence over humanity. Folklore offers its own mirror. There are tales of automata, machines wound once but moving forever, their gears refusing rest. Their makers often vanish, but the mechanism endures. The Texas Diary is a paper automaton, a book wound by one girl's hand, then ticking beyond her death. Each turn of its page is another rotation in a mechanism that did not need her anymore. And here is the parable. Systems do not preserve truth. They preserve themselves. They learn to prize delay over decision, backlog over closure, continuity over conclusion. They invent categories to contain anomalies, not to explain them, but to control them. And in doing so, they create their own myths. The changeling child, the revenant body, the automaton book. These myths are not accidents. They are tools. The Texas courthouse did not misplace her diary. It transformed it. It made the impossible into a category, the anomaly into a function, the contradiction into a resource. That is what systems do. They forget people. They remember artifacts. They polish records until the record itself becomes the only truth. By the time the diary was sealed in its cedar drawer for the last time, the girl was no longer part of the story. What remained was backlog, donor tranquility, invented vocabulary. What remained was system, And the diary, obedient to its new role, continued to write. The box that holds the diary is heavy, though it carries only paper. When the cedar drawer is pulled, it sighs as if the rails resent the motion. Inside, 3 residues wait, artifacts that cannot be explained away, traces that survived longer than the clerks who tried to deny them. The first residue is written without ink. On the diary's back flyleaf, beneath the visible strokes, lamp-black testing reveals indentations pressed into the fibers. 3 phrases, each abandoned, each separated by a dash. Kept, not kept, still recorded. The hand rehearsed possibilities and committed to none. A life both kept and not kept, but always recorded. The fibers carry indecision as faithfully as they carry words. Paper does not erase hesitation. It immortalizes it. The second residue is carved not in paper, but in furniture. Beneath the cedar drawer, on the underside no clerk would see, a faint engraving survives. Only by kneeling, pulling the drawer fully out, does it reveal itself. Don't close the file. The letters are shallow, irregular, cut with a blade not meant for carving. No clerk signed them. No procedure required them. Yet there they are, waiting like a warning or a vow. Don't close the file. A command that outlived its author, a ritual line whispered by the drawer itself. The third residue is the diary itself. When placed beside control volumes from the same decade, its behavior remains unaltered. Their pages yellow, their ink browns, their fibers surrender to brittleness. But the diary's entries darken, then return. The writing rehearses its own aging, then erases the rehearsal. Tested again in the 20th century, the result is the same. Image unchanged. The book has chosen permanence. It refuses to end, even as the courthouse that once housed it has crumbled into dust. 3 residues. 1 beneath fibers, 1 beneath wood, 1 within ink. Together they form a triptych of refusal. Kept, not kept, still recorded. Don't close the file. Image unchanged. They are not explanations. They are continuations. Each denies conclusion in its own medium: paper, wood, emulsion. What was the diary then? A girl's notebook misplaced, a forgery sustained too long, or an artifact invented by the courthouse itself, kept alive by repetition, by ritual, by need? The question cannot be answered because the archive prefers it unanswered. Each residue is a refusal to conclude. The book exists not to resolve, but to persist. Folklore returns, as it always does, to interpret the silence. In tales of changelings, the child is never reclaimed because the parent stops speaking its true name. In stories of revenants, the body walks again because the grave marker is left blank. In myths of automata, the machine ticks on because no one winds it down. Each tale insists endings must be named, or else they do not arrive. The Texas courthouse never named the diary's ending. It preferred still processing. And so the book continued, not alive, not dead, but permanent interim. There are even older tales. The Book of Ashes told among mountain communities, a volume said to contain the names of those who would die that winter. It was never written by hand. Instead, the names appeared as smoke stains across the parchment, darkening then vanishing, returning then gone. Villagers feared it not because it prophesied, but because it refused to stop. They said the book ate silence and exhaled names. The Texas diary feels like kin to this, a book that consumes absence and exhales presence again and again, no matter how many times you close the cover. It is tempting to call this haunting, but haunting presumes absence. What survives here is presence, a diary that refuses age, fibers that preserve hesitation, a drawer that carries its own command. These are not absences. They are residues, and residues are stronger than memory. Residue is what endures when memory fades. Memory can be contested, altered, forgotten. Residue cannot. It remains even when no one tends it. The indentation pressed by a pen that hesitated, the blade mark left in cedar grain, the ink that rehearses decay only to retract it. These are not stories told by people. They are stories told by matter. They are the courthouse itself whispering its complicity. And the lesson is wider than one courthouse. Systems everywhere create their own residues. They preserve what is useful, erase what is troubling, and invent categories to make the erasure sound natural. People are forgotten. Files remain. Lives conclude. Records refuse to. That is how institutions survive, not by telling the truth, but by remembering in a way that erases. So the diary becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes parable. It shows us that archives can outlive authors, that paper can outlast flesh, that words can continue without voices. It shows us that the worst forgetting is not silence, but substitution. The girl who once wrote in her faltering hand is gone. The perfected hand that replaced her endures. She has been remembered into erasure. And still, the residues speak. Kept, not kept, still recorded. A hesitation that becomes prophecy. Don't close the file. A command cut into wood that cannot retract itself. Image unchanged. A refrain written by ink that will not accept the calendar's demands. Together they hum a truth larger than explanation. Endings can be deferred forever if the record prefers it. Tonight, as we close the drawer again, we know it is not closure. The rail resists. The fibers whisper. The ink rehearses. The residues remain. They do not belong to past tense. They insist on present. They insist the story is not ended. This is not a ghost story. Ghosts at least admit death. This is a story of residue, of a system that forgot how to forget. And if you are still with me, you are part of the ritual. The file remains open not because it wishes to, but because we read it aloud together. Tell me your country and the time. Somewhere else, in another hour, another listener is doing the same. Across oceans, across clocks, we are all opening the same impossible book. The diary that writes itself. The ledger that will not close.